we've just heard some very good talks. I do not claim to be an expert on water, but I do know a thing or two about systems, about data, analytics, and I am an economist. So I've looked at water from this regard. I would just start by saying that I don't think we spend enough time appreciating what a miracle water is. So as a scientist, I would like to tell you that water is probably the most miraculous substance in the universe. It has one specific property that makes it so. It is considered a universal solvent. Now, what that means is that everything dissolves in water. In fact, in our blood is carried, all the hemoglobin, everything in our blood works because it's dissolved in water and carried. Our bodies, as you know, are 75% water when we're born and 60% by the time we age. We do lose some of that as our cells shrivel and die. Now, the reason why I mention this is that water isn't just important for us to be drinking, but literally in every single thing that we do as humanity, it matters. So when we do industry, you can't do industry without water. You can't do agriculture without water. You can't clean without water. And this actually represents the issue that we have. It is a multi-use, miraculous substance that, even though it exists in abundance in nature, the supply of actually clean water is what we are having to deal with in Pakistan. This issue that we're having overall in the world, and this is not just a Pakistani issue, as you know, is that historically water has not really been a problem unless there's been weather patterns, drought, etc. in the world. The issue is that we've exploded on the world in the last 100 years. So any metrics that you use in terms of population growth, industry growth, agricultural usage, we have just started to use so much more of the world's resources than the world has supplied, and we've historically used them the way we've traditionally used them. And in Pakistan, unfortunately, because of lack of all of the things that we've discussed already, we've been worse than most. As a result, if you look at this table, this is, and I apologize about the colors if they don't come out, but suffice it to say, Pakistan is the extremely high stress country on that map. India is better off than we are, and we should explore some of this, because this is what's coming up. At the same time, and we touched on this briefly, we also happen to have one of the most polluted supplies of water, or what we consider clean water. So not only does this affect us, it affects our agriculture, it affects our industry. As you know, water being the miracle it is also the leading cause of death in the world. Actually, every week, 16,000 people die of water-related diseases because of this issue. And we have it worse than most, out of which more than 50% are children. So that's a sobering fact. Now, our situation is exacerbated by the fact that even though we have a decent amount of water in terms of, we're 35th if you look at us in terms of land size, and we're 35th in terms of what they calculate to be sort of freshwater supplies available to us. However, that's not getting replenished easily. We're 162nd in the world in terms of renewable fresh water every year, which means that whatever we use, we are really, really low in the world in terms of how that gets replenished. Not only that, we are one of only a handful of countries, and most of the rest are in Africa and in Europe, where more than 50% of our water is coming from other countries. So these two factors mean that not only are we stressing ourselves because our population is growing, not only do we have contaminated water, but our actually supply of water doesn't get replenished very, very easily. What that says to me is that really our goal in Pakistan is conservation of water. So let's talk a little bit more about that and why that's important. So just some stats to tell you about how severely we've gone from being a country that was blessed with lots of water to being a country that has issues with water. If you look at this chart, we sort of done a couple of data pieces here, but if you look at 1950, which let's say talk about it as like the birth of Pakistan as it were, we had about 5,000 cubic meters per inhabitant per year. Now that's really high. If you look at all the tables right now, that's actually at the top of the list. We're now down to around 800 to 900 cubic meters of water, which is actually not bad But unfortunately, as you know, in Pakistan, it's not 900 cubic meters uniformly, right? So you have people in Pakistan that are using well above 1,000, 1,200, and then you have some poor people in places like Thar who are actually averaging about 100 in terms of usage. And the UN says 1,000 is needed, right, for a person to be able to be clean and healthy, etc. So I think our situation is that the lack of actually doing anything about water has created a really, really severe crisis for us, and will continue to create it for us. And most of the crisis is of our own doing because we haven't done much about it. We've talked about this percentage. Rafi gave a percentage that was much higher. He said it's almost 96%. But however you look at this, this is Pakistan's usage of water. The global average is 70% on agri, and then I think 20% on industries, and then 10%. In industrialized countries, Belgium has 80% of its water uses is industry. So the very first thing I would like to point out here is that we, people, are not the main drain on water. The main drain on water is what we have done in terms of our economic progress and growth, whether in terms of agriculture or in terms of industry. This is important to understand because those two uses and how well we use water in industry and in agriculture essentially determine what happens to us going forward. You know, the stats on this, I haven't put it down on paper, but you know, we hear numbers, and Rafi mentioned that something like 50% or 40 to 60% of the agricultural water that we use is not used well, is wasted. Well, I mean, right here, if you think that Karachi has a water problem, if you can get agriculture to even be 20% more efficient, then I think that downstream a lot of us would have a lot more water available to us. All of this means that if we don't do much about it, we have, and it's coming up fast and we're already there, we have like a big shortage. We have a gap in our water which is actually quite sustainable. And we need to therefore figure out how we use water better, because certainly, as we've discussed for all the reasons, we don't have that much, we don't replenish our water fast enough in terms of natural replenishment. We have India and Afghanistan that control more than 50% of our water resources that come to us. We have to be worried about how to use water better. Now, the good thing with this, and this is all the bad news, let me come to the good news with this. The good news with this is that this is not new technologies. These aren't new things. This is not like we're asking people in Pakistan to do something that has only been done in the West or is being done by people who are much more educated than we are as a nation. These are solutions that are in place everywhere. And what I'd like to point out as a group of citizens, as a community here, I'd like to point out that these are not solutions that were necessarily done by national governments. A lot of these are solutions that were done at the local level, by communities, by villages, by cities when they had issues. And I'd like to suggest to us that as Karachiites, we should be thinking in this fashion for ourselves. So let me start with a story from Cape Town. You guys, a lot of you must have seen the story. It's Cape Town, the way it's located, it has a natural reservoir of water, but when it doesn't rain for a while, the reservoir gets depleted. And it started happening. And this is a story about, in the last year and a half. Now, immediately what they did is that it took immediate action by awareness campaigns, etc. You know, Rafi talked about the importance of awareness, and I cannot stress this enough. What people don't know, they can't do anything about. So I think the very first thing that you see in Cape Town is that they immediately went down in reduction simply by awareness. Then in terms of short term, they started to work on reclaiming water. Now, it would surprise people to know that the World Bank, the UN, considers that wastewater to actually be one of our most prized resources in the world. You know, we don't understand, and we don't understand the impact of wastewater, but through all of our agriculture, our own uses, and industrial processes, nearly 50 to 60% of all water is wastewater. And you'll see examples of countries where wastewater is the actual way they've managed to sustain amazing agriculture, nothing else. It's the cycle of wastewater that they've done. And then the investment actions they took, and this is interesting because, you know, we talk about things like desalination plants. It's been very difficult. We as Karachiites have seen a case study on this that hasn't been very nice for us. We've tried this and it's failed. But I'd like to point out, that in a city which had this issue, they now have 8 desal plants up and running. So this is a local city solution that they put in place as they had the need. Now, similarly, let me move on to a more rural and interesting solution in India. Now, again, people might think this is modern, but the Persians were doing this a long time ago. This is the basis, actually, of a lot of the agricultural growth that we had before we had technology, which is that, in any area, as you have rain, you can find the lowest point in the area, and if you are good about it, you can build a silo and collect water. Now, just by doing that, you look at the numbers that you end up having, and the difference is astronomical, right? So the one system basically means that you don't have access to water pretty much most of the time. The other system means you have access to water the whole time. This is something which is already in India. There's already more than 1,200 of these in place. You will find, I was trying to do a count on the number of well-based systems in the world, but I stopped because they were in the hundreds of thousands all over the world, right? So this is not new. This just has to be done. I have a couple of examples. I'm conscious of our time, but all of us are UAE. We realize what the UAE has done and the actions they've taken. They're obviously very, very forward about this. And what you start to notice is a pattern in all of these examples, which is that whenever people actually have crises is when they tend to act, right? So in the example of the UAE, their crisis was no water and a lot of people. And that was the act that they've taken. So they actually have a very integrated water management, delivery, waste system that really tries to do the best it can to conserve as much water as possible. This example I'd give, and it's important for the reason that I spoke about. In the middle of the desert, Israel has created what is considered to be the best farming and agricultural land in the world in terms of the yields it gives, in terms of the quality of the product, etc. Now, if you look at this farmland, it doesn't look like farmland you'd see, because you'll see these green fields and then you'll see just desert. And the desert is just clay and mud. And the reason that they've been able to do that is that they've treated the entire area as a system. So any water that enters this, however it enters, gets metered, first of all, gets understood. Any waste that comes out gets treated, which means that 85% of what they put in, they're reusing. And that takes their actual water footprint down to the sort of level where once you start to get this in motion, the actual cost of water to them is a very advantageous cost, and it's actually highly clean. We talked about desalination plants. Rafi mentioned Singapore and what they work on. It would surprise you to know, it surprised me, this number. There are over 18,000 desal plants in the world. So anybody that tells you that this is like stuff that nobody's done, are wrong. This has been done by governments, this has been done by individuals, this has been done by public-private partnerships, this has been done in Africa, in Middle East, in Asia, all over the world. I won't go through this example. The other thing I'd like to tell you is, we talked a little bit about wastewater. Wastewater, I think, deserves a whole section. We need to educate ourselves on it because there's so much of it. Just, again, the technologies of wastewater are not only well understood, but they're big enough that they're actually forecasts on the revenues of companies in these sectors, right? So when we start to go down this list, you start to see things that might sound to people who are not scientists to be, oh, why, all of that is just how do we decide what to do? But these choices are being made, globally all the time. So I think for us, the number one thing that I'd be encouraging, as I think Rafi also mentioned, is educate ourselves. Unless we educate ourselves on the stuff we've talked about, I don't actually think we're going to understand what it is we can do about this problem. Part of the education just has to be the fact that lots of people in the world actually have solved this. Part of the education has to be that people have solved this at a local and at an individual and at a community level, and not just at a government level. So we need to stop thinking that the government is going to do this for us. So let's assume they will, but we have to do our own stuff. So the number two thing I've learned, and I'd encourage you to do, is conserve water. You know, it's a telling case that the only people I think in Pakistan who have some sense of water conservation, and sadly, are us Karachiites. And that simply might be because we pay for it. You know, if I didn't have to pay for my water, I might be taking 30-minute showers, like a lot of my friends up north do. But because I pay for my water, I take 10-minute showers and I switch it off every single time I soap myself. Now, if you look at the cost of that 30-minute shower versus that 10-minute shower in terms of just the amount of additional water I would need in my house that I would need to pay for, we are not talking about water that people in Pakistan can afford. It's 5,000 to 10,000 rupees a month that I would have to pay extra if all 4 people in my family took that sort of a shower. Therein, I think, is the problem, that outside of us who pay for it, the rest of us don't understand how to conserve it. But I think we need to educate ourselves and figure out how we can start conserving. And by the way, conserving water is not just about, again, as I said, at the community level, but we can start to do it ourselves. The third thing, which I think we just need to start to do, and I think this is actually, again, doable at our own levels, at industries that we own, at farms that we might run, is to treat wastewater. You know, the simple fact is that while the economics right now, because nobody really in Pakistan has to pay for water outside of Karachiites, while the economics of water mean that anything you do with water requires you to spend more money, I think that treating wastewater as a Karachiite or people in Karachi makes a lot of sense. This is why actually you have people who have invested in RO plants. I mean, if it's costing me 3 tankers, 30,000 rupees or more perhaps a month for my water, then perhaps it makes a lot of sense for me to treat my own water, make sure that my sewage water from my own house is collected separately, strained, recycled, there's a septic tank. So again, I think we need to start to educate ourselves on ways we can conserve, ways we can treat water. And the last thing which I'd recommend us do as a community, and we'll talk this afternoon more about how to do this, is the idea of investing in local supply of water. You know, I think we have the ability to not only consider public-private partnerships for desalination, I also think we have the ability to consider building and funding what are natural, man-made, smaller reservoirs for runoffs, for things such as rain, etc. And obviously, I think we have the ability to repair some of the infrastructure that we have. But I think this is what we can do as the people sitting in this room, as our government, I think, tries to sort some of the larger issues such as dams upstream, such as the actual storage supply we have as a country. Thank you very much.